In this lecture, we're going to talk about good manufacturing practices, the GMP, which are very complementary, to the good laboratory practices, the GLP that I talked about in the last lecture. Most of the times, people call them the current, good manufacturing practices. And the importance is that again it's a legislative set of practices that companies or chemical industries that manufacture products that are used by the public must adhere to. And so if at all you're going to a company that is manufacturing products, and some of you are, you'll be required, to abide, by the good manufacturing practices, as the company, of course, has to adhere to that. And the reason, people call it the current, is because it's supposed to be a dynamic document, meaning it should be improved and optimized, as the need arises. And of course, the goal, for all this, the GMP, as well as the GLP that I talked about previously, the goal, is to protect the public. Now, the inception of the GMP, again, is started in the US, and it's drafted, or was drafted, by the Food, Drug and Administration, Food Drug FDA, to ensure the manufacturers provide safe and effective products, to the public. Again, the goal is to protect the public, which is a crucial responsibility of us as chemical professionals. So as we did with the GLP, let me take you, through the history, of the GMP. And like anything else, any set of guidelines or policies often start with a problem. It starts, with a whistleblower, really. Now, the GMP started, from the work of this gentleman who was a journalist from this book, that he published in 1906. And so it was called The Jungle. And it exposed the health violations and unsanitary working conditions in a meat packaging plant in a couple of different cities, but particularly, Chicago. Now, this drove the public opinion, to support a law in Congress, to regulate the quality, of foods. Particularly, the idea was to make sure that foods are not adulterated and they are safe, for public consumption. Now, and as such, initially we had the Congress approving, for what they call the Meat Inspection Act, as well as, the Pure Food and Drug Act, which actually largely came to be a little bit after in the 1930s. But initially in 1906, Congress actually approved, the Meat Inspection Act, arising from, the whistleblower, Upton Sinclair, on the conditions, to which the meat, was being processed, at that particular time. I must, however, mention, there's a caveat here, because Sinclair's book, while it focused quite a bit, on the health violations and unsanitary conditions, its intent, was actually the harsh conditions and exploitation of the immigrants, that were working on those particular plants. However, that did not catch, the public uproar, and so they mainly focused, on the health violations, and leading, of course, to the Meat Inspection Act, passed by the Congress thereafter. And that shows you, really, how sometimes the public, can take and cherry pick, certain aspects, of the intent, of what is being communicated, because the whole intent really was to raise the idea of racial discrimination. His book was mainly intended to raise awareness about racial discrimination, among the immigrants and so on. And as such, although that's a topic for another day, as chemical professionals, really, we must rise up, to this historical mess, of subjugation, among certain type of races, and ensure equity, diversity, and inclusion, for all. And we've got a long way to go. And I think this story really shows you, how the public, can be fairly uh, inept, in taking the whole picture and sort of cherry picking, what they can focus on. But again, that's a story for another day. But as professional chemists, we are required, to rise up, against, biases and ensure inclusion, diversity, in our workplaces. So while the GMP really started initially, with this Meat Inspection Act, as I've mentioned, in the 1930s, again, due to another problem that arose, it was harmonized, to extend to regulate, medical and cosmetic products. And, that started in the 1930s, due especially, to this question of this antibiotic called sulfanilamide, which when it was, went to the market, it cost actually deaths of up to 100, people in the US. And it was discovered later, by the FDA, remember this drug, this Meat Inspection Act, later became the FDA, in the 1930s, sort of, to harmonize the inclusion, of not only food, but also pharmaceutical compounds, and so forth. And so the sulfanilamide, the companies, are using, diethylene glycol, as a solvent. And that's how the FDA discovered, that these deaths, the poisoning of the people, was due to the use of that solvent, in this particular antibiotic. And as such, the FDA started to regulate. It's not just the active ingredient, which is the sulfanilamide, but also, the other non-active ingredients, that are present in a product, they need to be safe. So the focus shifted, not just, from the active compound, but also, to the non-active compounds. In this case, the solvents, that were being used and that had escaped, the importance of how they can actually affect, the public. Now, much more tweaking happened, in 1960s, again, because of another big issue on thalidomide in the 1960s, which is a pharmaceutical product or a chemical compound that was used against things like the morning sicknesses, and it was shown also to be active against anxieties and so forth. But and so it was used, a lot, and marketed, for pregnant mothers, to take care of morning sicknesses, and those kinds of indications. Unfortunately, following their use, it was found that lots of babies, are actually born with defects, up to 10,000 actually it's reported. 40%, of whom, actually died, at birth. And so again, the FDA, investigated, what's the problem, and they discovered, the problem is actually the thalidomide. And the problem is that the thalidomide, exists in two forms, in two isomers. So it's enantiomeric, meaning you can have the R and you can have, the S type of isomer. Now the R is effective, yes, towards, sedative effect, so it can be used, as a pharmaceutical product. Unfortunately, the S, is actually teratogenic. And that is why, the babies, are being affected because it can pass, the placenta, in the mother's, womb, and then affect the formation, of the fetus. And so the FDA, started to regulate, the fact that the purity of the drug, has to be taken care of, because previously people didn't care really to purify the pharmaceutical products, to ensure, that whatever they are putting to the public, it's fairly well studied to ensure the purity, of the compound, and to ensure any impurity, of course, doesn't affect the public. So you can see the different type of iterations, occasioned really, by a crisis. Maybe the take-home message, for us is, as chemical professionals, the impact of whatever we do is very, very significant, really. You can see the impacts that we are talking about, public safety, and the effects can be very, very significant. So as we go about, our practice, it's good to think even futuristic, and study the type of compounds, that we are working with, to ensure their sustainability, their efficacy, and to see the totality, of its impact, be it the solvents, be it any impurities, that could be present. And that's why as a professional chemist, we need to be very, very accurate, in terms of what we do, and hopefully accurate the first time, because of the effects, that you've already seen that can happen, especially to the public. So quick comment, the FDA, then structure, you can see is a very vast organization, that regulates, lots of different types of substances. And so it's divided into 8 branches, each branch, regulating, specific types of substances within, those branches, veterinary medicine, drug evaluation, like you talk about the vaccines and so on, they have to go through the FDA approvals, to guarantee their safety to the public and so forth. Now, the Canada variation of the FDA, is what you call the Health Canada Health Products and Food Branch. And again, so this is the equivalent, of FDA in Canada. Now, HPFB, the Canadian variation, really, just like the FDA, defines a substance or a mixture of substances, as follows, so they can be substances that are used for diagnosis. So the substances that they regulate can be used for treatment. So they define those substances, that they can be used, for mitigation and so forth. So they also regulate substances, that restore, correct, or modify, organic functions in animals and humans. They also regulate, things like the disinfection products, that are used, to preserve food and so forth. So it's really every aspect, of products, that are of chemical nature. And of course, this means literally quite a bit, that are consumed or that are applied, to people and as well, to animals as well. So the GMP really, ensures its purpose is to guarantee, and I'm just summarizing, is to guarantee safety, to ensure that the products that are taken by the public, do not have unwanted side effects. So the purpose of the GMP also is to guarantee the identity, of the product, such that whatever the manufacturer labels the product to be, its identity is authentic. The purpose also of the GMP is to ensure that the correct dosage, that is required is adhered to, in that product, meaning the potency of that product has got the right type of dose that is needed. So you cannot add a dose, you cannot overdose as well, because of course both are fairly are bad, of course, for the consumers. Very important, the purity. The purity of the product, needs to be guaranteed, no contamination. And contamination is a big problem, as you well know, in the lab and so on. And so contamination, be it of the raw material, whatever you start with, or even the contamination, of the product at the end, it's very significant, be a very significant problem. And so the purity, of the product, both the raw material as well as the final product, need to be guaranteed. And that's why chromatography really is such an important part of, chemical industry in terms of separation to ensure the quality, the purity rather, of the product. And all these, of course, the purpose is to ensure the quality of the product, to the consumers. And so the benefit of the GMP is, especially to benefit all of us, first, of course, satisfied customers, but also it ensures that the product that is given to the humans or animals, is of guaranteed quality and does not cause harm. It is potent. It does not have any side effects. And it controls, the possibility of mislabeling, falsification of labels, or even adulteration of foods, meaning whatever you are taking as a product, has got is authentic, is not adulterated, is authentic. And adulteration is a big problem, especially in cosmetic products, which are less regulated, compared to the pharmaceutical products. So adulteration can be a big problem. Of course, you can see the effects, can be very significant, like in the 1906, the adulteration, of meat product and so forth. So the GMP also, regulates things like the rejects or the recalls and traces, where all those products, are stored and so on. Again, for the sake of the public. But very important also, the reason why every company really need to follow these practices, very important, of course, for their bottom line and their reputation as well. And so as you go, of course, to the industry again, you're taking such a responsibility because you're really an ambassador, should I say, in terms of the way you do things, to that company's image, and reputation. Very quickly, the key parts of the current GMPs in terms of all the different levels, that it regulates. So this documentation encompasses, all these different categories. It talks about the personnel and the organization. In terms of, again, the personnel needs to be adequately trained, to do the work that they are supposed to do. It also talks a lot, about, the building and the facilities where the work is done. So the building needs to be adequate. The things like the airflow, the sanitation, it's clean, the environmental controls. Things like the microbial levels, the air quality in the room, all those are documented, in the GMP, for the organizations. Now, things like the equipment, that are being used, again, there's documentation on that in terms of their installation. They have to be verified or qualified such that, the instrument is doing what it is, or the equipment is doing what it's supposed to do. So a lot of documentation in terms of its installation, in terms of its design, in terms of the operation of that equipment. It needs to be, again, qualified. In terms of frequent assessment of the performance of the equipment being used, probably to manufacture or to test the quality of the drug. all those things needs to be qualified, and there's documentation and layers of verification, especially by quality control chemists, to guarantee all that. There's also, documentation needed under the GMP to verify, of course, the quality of the raw materials coming in, as well as the quality, of the product going out, again, to ensure that there is no contamination, either due to the storage, that we talked about, because storage can, if at all the product is stored improperly, things like microbial growth can happen, adulteration can also happen there, possibly from oxidation and so forth. So again, all those needs to be documented, under the GMP. So a lot of documentation, really. Many others, there's documentation on the packaging and the labeling control, meaning there's verification on that as part of the GMP. In terms of the storage facility, there should be traceability of the product as well as the raw material, where was it brought from, when was it manufactured, and so on, so there's documentation on that. And just like the GLP, there's documentation on laboratory controls, who did the inspections and so forth, the analysis. Again, that's a major overlap with the GLP. And of course, more documentation on the record of the reports, especially the analytical aspects. Again, you can see the lab notebook here. Everything needs to be documented, so that everything is very traceable in terms of where it came from and so on. So maybe the take-home message, especially, in this paragraph here, is ensure good documentation practices. The documentation, should be permanent, legible, concise, accurate, and detailed enough, to ensure that the auditors, can follow the trail, of what is happening. It also regulates or documents things like what happens to the returned or salvaged, for example, drug products. Again, a lot of documentation, especially for you guys going to manufacturing. You're gonna see there's a lot of documentation to make sure that the companies adhere to these very stringent GMP regulations. So think really, again, of GMP as a lifestyle. It's important, to document things, for things to be very, very traceable, for equipment and buildings and everything to be very qualified, to be effective and accurate, for the work that it's supposed to do. And the products coming out, are pure and effective or potent, towards what they are meant to accomplish. So lastly, let me talk very briefly, about project management. Now, you will be managing projects, in the industry, okay? And maybe one way to think about a project is that you need to account, for these three aspects in the project, and even document it. You need to account for the scope of what you're working on, the scope of the project. You need to account in your project plan, the schedule, what needs to be done and when, what are the deliverables and the time that you're supposed to deliver, those tasks. And of course, maybe in this case for you guys, you wouldn't be involved a lot on the budget. But again, later on, when you're hired or when you start companies and so on, and you're managing projects, of course, the budget, is another consideration. And the three of these things, when done well, guarantees really quality delivery, of your project, which could be products, or services. And so as you go to the industry, I think I'd like you to be able to manage the project, that you are given, possibly by your industry supervisor, and be able to document and think of it in terms of documenting, what is needed to deliver that project. And so in essence, what I'm saying is, you need to have a work plan, when you're given a project to work on. And a work plan, refers to a dynamic schedule, that records and keeps track, of all the tasks, that need to be accomplished over the course of the project. So it's very common, for people, to use what they call the Gantt chart. And I would really encourage you to do the same when you're given a project, to document its scope and break it down in terms of its schedule and indicate, when each schedule needs to be done. So the work plan should include, of course, the scope of what needs to be done, and a statement of work, a description of the objectives, of the project. It's important to document that. And then, of course, you break it down into the structure of the components and the subcomponents and the tasks, that needs to be accomplished. And possibly it's good to have a graphical way to view that in form of a Gantt chart. So in your monthly reports, I'd like you guys to sort of document, indicate in the monthly reports, how you did your project and formulate it, in form of a work plan, the scope of the project, also the statement of the work that was to be done, and how it was done and when it was done. And that should be included, in the monthly report. And again, as I mentioned before, I'm gonna give you templates, on what things that you need to include in your monthly reports. But it's very important, for us to start to get used, to having managing projects, by documenting it, in such kind of a format. Of course, there's a lot that can be said about project management. In fact, there are courses and certifications, of project management. But that's all that I'm gonna say in this case about project management. All right. So maybe as I summarize, and I got this, online, the 10 commandments, of project management. Maybe one of them is, thou shalt have a project with a goal. So essentially always have a goal, in your project. And of course, the goal needs to be documented, needs to be achievable, needs to be measurable as well, so that you can know when you achieve it. The second commandment here is, honor thy project objectives. Make sure the objectives of the project, the why you're doing the project, is documented, and at least you achieve it. You shall not commit to a schedule. Thou shalt commit to the schedule that management has given thee. Well, so again, make sure you achieve, what you've laid to achieve in a timely fashion. It's always good, to check. Remember the checkpoints, remember what has been already accomplished. In your Gantt chart, it's important to delegate the work. You don't have to do everything, but again, make sure it's all documented who is supposed to do what. Pictures are always useful. Again, that's why flowchart, as I mentioned, the Gantt charts are very good, for assessing, the progress of what is being achieved. It's all about collaboration. We should always work well, with our teams, and that's very important. And it aligns, with the professional ethics, about how we treat our team members. And of course, take ownership of any mistakes, that happen. And ensure, of course, the team is informed on what is going on and their expectations are clear. And this one I think is very, very important. And encourage creativity. And I think creativity is only encouraged if you let your people, that the team members, take responsibility for the work that they are doing. And that way they can be creative, to offer their best. And I think organizations have got a long way to go, in terms of managing, their employees to encourage innovation and creativity and optimization and so on by people believing, in their team members. And again, that's all I'm gonna say really, about project management. And so that brings us to the end, the professional ethics seminar, the GMP, the GLP, as well as, the short segment about project management as you go to the industry. So you need to go online, and do your WIMI training, and that one is related, to safety. And you need to do that, by January the 16th, and you'll be given a certificate, that you should upload on Blackboard. Also, I'm gonna post online a professional ethics exam, that you should complete, by January the 16th, and I'm gonna post it, on Blackboard by this weekend. And again, from the notes, you'll be able to answer most of the questions in this professional ethics exam. So that's it, and thank you.